A very good afternoon and a warm welcome to the first special lecture of the 15th All India Conference of China Studies organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati, in cooperation with Guwahati University and Omyo Kumar Das Institute of Social Change and Development in partnership with the India office Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We are glad to have Professor Kamal Sheel as the chair for this session. Professor Sheel is a retired professor of Chinese, Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, and honorary fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies. We are delighted to have Professor Madhavi Thampi to deliver a lecture on World War II, the Crucible of Modern Sino-Indian Relations. Madhavi Thampi is an honorary fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and former editor of the journal China Report. Her detailed bio and that of Professor Sheel is available in the brochure. That the link is, I've just entered the link in the chat box. This talk will focus on the interactions between India and China during the Second World War. Her talk will cover a period of tremendous expansion and diversification of China-India relations and will thus throw light on issues that have prevented the full development of this potential in the subsequent decades. Before I invite Professor Sheel to begin with the proceedings, let me lay out a few housekeeping rules. All participants except the speaker will be muted for the duration of the event. Participants are requested to send in their queries in the chat box or use the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when called upon by the chair to do so. I will now invite the chair to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir. Professor Sheel? Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm really happy to chair a session by Professor Madhavi Thampi, who is one of the most renowned historian on China in India. And it's really a great pleasure to chair this session and invite her to deliver a keynote address on World War II, the crucible of modern India-China relations. So over to Professor Thampi.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheel, and good afternoon to everybody. I feel very honored to deliver this lecture at the 15th AICCS on India-China relations during World War II, which is a subject that has been engaging my interest these last few years. As part of a larger project to catalog materials pertaining to modern China in the National Archives of India, Dr. Nirmala Sharma and I had produced an annotated catalog of materials from the period of World War II, compiled from the proceedings of what was then called the Foreign and Political Department of the Government of India. I was astounded by the amount of material we came across. More than 1,000 files, with some of them running into several hundred pages each. This drew me back to looking more closely at some of these files after the work of producing the catalog was over. I wanted to see if they yielded information or insights that scholars may have overlooked and which may throw new light on the evolution of modern India-China relations. This work has taken me longer than expected, and I am nowhere near completion, partly because of the pandemic, which made physically accessing these files difficult. However, what I have seen has convinced me that this period has been unjustifiably glossed over in the narratives on the evolution of India-China relations. Based largely on these materials, I'm going to present in this forum some very preliminary thoughts about this period and its importance. It is a happy coincidence that a theme of this conference is connected geographies. Geography has played a major role in the relations between the regions which we call India and China. But one of the takeaways of this study is that geographies are not fixed and they are not always what they seem. They have to be viewed in their context. The same geographical features that may seem to divide, such as impossibly high mountains and vast bodies of water, can provide means of passage and factors that promote interdependency. What may seem to be peripheral regions in one context can become regions of critical importance in another context. They can become vital gateways to the outside world at times when other doors are closed. Political factors can also turn what appears to be barren, inhospitable terrain into areas of bitter contestation between states. I hope that some of these issues become clearer through this talk. I would like to argue that relations between India and China in the period from 1939 to 1945 have been neglected not because they were actually of little consequence, but because of a blinkered approach to the subject of India-China relations that has characterized the official and scholarly as well as the popular discourse. The tendency in contemporary India and China to perceive and frame their historical interactions within the limits of bilateral relations between two nation states, or to a friendship versus enmity binary, obscures the complexity and diversity of their connections, as well as their embeddedness in the wider region and the world as a whole. For a long time, interactions between India and China in the colonial era were viewed as being of little consequence because of the domination of both countries by imperialist powers at that time. Yet this was actually a period of new forms, routes, and sites of interaction, while earlier forms of interaction, for example, the overland trade and cultural interaction through the Himalayan passes, about which we have heard a lot in the last session, while these older forms continued. Although spawned by imperialist networks, the movement and connections among traders, smugglers, migrants, pilgrims, businessmen, officials, intellectuals, soldiers, travelers, and political exiles all contributed to the tangled web of India-China interactions in the modern era. These interactions that were developing through the 19th and early 20th centuries came to a head in the late 1930s and early 1940s for various reasons. One was the growth of mutual interest in each other on the part of Indians and Chinese, spurred by a shared anti-imperialism and nationalist resurgence. Another reason was the outbreak of World War II and the growing importance of India and China to each other for their defense and survival in the face of Japanese expansionism. Yet another factor was the mass displacement of peoples and the disruption of usual routes of transport and movement due to war and civil strife. In the rest of this talk, I will try to give a brief overview of three aspects of wartime relations between India and China. First, we will look at the unprecedented official push given to the expansion of ties in diverse spheres. These were as wide-ranging as trade and commerce, military relations, diplomacy, scientific and technical cooperation, transport and communications, as well as health, education, and culture. In short, they represented the beginnings of modern state-to-state relations between India and China, even though India was still under British rule and much of China was under Japanese occupation. The second aspect we will consider will be the impact of the war on the movement of peoples between India and China, including, as I mentioned some of them before, migrants, traders, pilgrims, officials, students, refugees, deserters, seamen, adventurers, and smugglers. Some of this represented a continuation and intensification of earlier patterns of trade gendered by the special circumstances of wartime. Lastly, we will consider the complicated political dimensions of the relationship. While India and China were officially allies during the war, the interests of the nationalist government in China, the British Indian government, and the various strands within the Indian national movement often diverged considerably. Moreover, considerations about the impending post-war order in Asia gave rise to enhanced geopolitical rivalry, along with tensions over borders, infiltration, and the struggle for influence and control over regions like Tibet. This ambivalence and strategic rivalry have continued to mold the trajectory of India-China relations in the decades since. I will now take these up one by one, these issues. So starting with the expansion of official ties. Now, even before World War II, the nationalist government headed by Chiang Kai-shek in China and the Indian National Congress led by Jawaharlal Nehru had begun to chart out a course of collaboration between the two countries. The visit of Nehru to Chongqing in 1939, just as war broke out in Europe, yielded a list of areas in which China and India could cooperate. However, World War II, and particularly the Japanese rampage through Southeast Asia, underscored the importance of Sino-Indian collaboration, not just as a future aspiration, but as an urgent necessity. It also put the British government of India, rather than Nehru and the Congress, in the driver's seat from the Indian side in this period. Perhaps for this reason, the unprecedented expansion of interactions between India and China at this time has not been given the attention it deserves, either in independent India or the People's Republic of China. As a result of the Japanese occupation of vast areas of eastern and central China, the nationalist government was forced to shift its headquarters deeper into the interior and western region of China. The importance of regions to the west, and especially countries like India, became obvious to China. Writing as Foreign Secretary of the Government of India, Sir Olaf Caro noted that, quote, China during the war has become far more India conscious than she ever has been before, unquote. Jawaharlal Nehru expressed the same thought more poetically when he said, quote, China for the first time for some generations began to look towards her western and southwestern neighbors. Her outlook, which had been governed so long by the treaty ports, was changed by circumstances, and the hand of destiny began to link together again the fate of India and China, unquote. So India had indeed acquired a pivotal role in China's war of resistance as a major transit point for the movement of both supplies and people into non-occupied China from the rest of the world. Particularly after the inauguration of US Lend-Lease supply arrangements to China, the quantity of material destined for China's war effort from outside increased substantially, and much of this had to pass through India. Not just military, but civilian supplies for China were either sourced from or passed through India. To oversee these operations, representatives of a number of Chinese agencies were posted in India during the war. These included, for instance, representatives from the China National Aviation Corporation, or CNAC as it was called, China Defense Supplies, the Chinese Board of Transport Control, the National Resources Commission, the Bank of China, China's Ministry of Information, Ministry of Finance, and many other agencies. A special post of China Relations Officer had to be created by the Government of India in Calcutta to handle the multitude of Chinese agencies operating in India. Later, to cope with the volume of work, another post of China Relations Officer was established in New Delhi as well. The expansion of overland connectivity was one of the most striking developments in India-China interactions during the war. From June 1942 to September 1945, a total of over 700,000 tons of goods and over 33,000 passengers were flown over the hump, as that stretch of the Eastern Himalaya was known, by the CNAC and the American volunteer group nicknamed the Flying Tigers. Flying this dangerous air route was costly in terms of planes and human life lost en route, but the whole operation, almost unprecedented in scale and conception, played a significant role in the Chinese resistance to Japan. Compared to the airlift, the Ledo Road, or the Stilwell Road as it was better known, carried much less, a total of 129,000 tons of goods, as the war ended just a few months after it was inaugurated in January 1945. The southern arm of the Ledo Road was also the route of a critical oil pipeline that was built between Calcutta and Kunming in China. Work on the pipeline began in December 1943, and at its completion in April 1945, it spanned a distance of over 3,000 kilometers. Over 100,000 tons of oil was transported along this line. There were other more low-profile supply routes as well, supply and communication routes. This included the old Tea-Horse Road, Chamalu, as it was known, through Tibet into Yunnan, which was used to transport only non-military, but nevertheless essential supplies to southwest China from India. Approximately 8,000 mules and horses and 20,000 yaks plied this route during the war. Another traditional route used was the pack supply route from Gilgit to Kashgar in Xinjiang. Wireless communications were opened between Delhi and Chandu, while postal communications were inaugurated between northwestern India and Xinjiang, and also between India and southwestern China via Rima and Tibet. The hectic activity along these routes and modes of connectivity had the effect of bringing India and China physically closer in a very real sense. But of course, another consequence was the heightened interest on both sides in border zones and boundary issues. After the United States entered the war in late 1941, India and China were for military purposes linked together in a single theater of war known as the China-Burma-India theater, which you may have all heard of. One consequence of this, which was cloaked in a veil of secrecy during the war, was the existence for the first time in the modern era of a Chinese army on Indian soil. The Chinese army in India, or the Chinese Expeditionary Force as it was also known, was stationed at a former prisoner of war camp in Ramgarh in the present-day state of Jharkhand. The original 9,000 troops who formed the nucleus of the Chinese army in India were Chinese soldiers in Burma who had been forced to retreat into India after the Japanese invaded that country between June and September 1942. It was a joint decision of the Allies to reconstitute these soldiers after providing them with the necessary training and equipment into an elite strike force, which would, when the time was right, take part again in military operations in Burma. Over the next couple of years, additional forces were flown in from China to Ramgarh for training, and eventually over 50,000 Chinese officers and men passed through the Ramgarh training camp in India over a period of 3 years. Eventually, in 1945, the CAI divisions took part in the battles to liberate Burma from the Japanese. This is certainly one of the more remarkable but least known instances of Sino-Indian military cooperation in modern times. The 666 graves of Chinese soldiers buried in a Chinese cemetery near Ramgarh are a lasting physical reminder of this. Modern diplomatic relations between India and China were also first established during the war and not after 1949, as some may think. Although earlier matters concerning India and China had been handled by the British Embassy and consulates in China, the expansion of connections between the two countries in this period necessitated an envoy who would devote himself to what was called matters purely affecting Sino-Indian relations. However, an equally important reason for the appointment of an Indian envoy to China must have been a political one. At a time when the nationalist government and Chiang Kai-shek personally were taking a keen interest in Indian political affairs, having an Indian representative who could explain the British government's policy vis-a-vis India and Indian independence would have been seen as more effective. The only other Indian envoy abroad at this time was posted to the United States, where too British policy toward India had come in for criticism. Since India was not yet independent, the Indian envoy was called Agent General, while the Chinese envoy was called Commissioner. The first Indian Agent General in China was Sir Zafarullah Khan, who was followed a year later by KPS Menon, who remained at this post for another 5 years or so. The first Chinese commissioner in India was Fen Shuhua. Among his tasks, he had to oversee the work of the numerous Chinese agencies and individuals posted in China during the war, as well as maintain contact with Chinese in India, who included both the more long-term settlers as well as people stranded in India because of the war. The Indian Agent General, on his part, reported on the fast-changing developments in China and maintained ties with leading Chinese statesmen and officials, while also overseeing the affairs of the Indians in China, many of whom suffered greatly in this period due to war and political turbulence. Although Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek had earlier envisaged the development of closer educational and cultural ties between India and China, this was taken up in earnest during the war. One of the significant developments on this front was the agreement signed in 1942 between the Government of India and the Nationalist Government of China for each to sponsor the studies of 10 students from the other country. This marked the first officially sponsored exchange of students between India and China in their modern history. This was accompanied by measures to establish chairs in Indian and Chinese universities to accommodate eminent academics from both sides. Under these schemes, well-known academics, scientists, and cultural figures like C.V. Raman, S.S. Bhatnagar, Nandlal Bose, S. Radhakrishnan, and others visited China. Chinese artists like Xu Beihong and the eminent Chinese Buddhist monk Tai Xu also visited India. A number of Chinese engineers, agricultural scientists, doctors, and other scientific and technical personnel visited Indian universities and institutes and studied there for varying lengths of time. Dr. Arunabh Ghosh has recently published a very interesting study of the close collaboration between the noted Indian paleobotanist Birbal Sahni and his Chinese doctoral student Xu Ren around this period. After many decades of Chinese and Indian students and experts looking only to the West or Japan for knowledge and models, the war provided the conditions under which Indians and Chinese began to look to each other and see what they could learn from each other. Many forms of officially sponsored interaction and collaboration between India and China, which we usually associate with the heyday of the Hindi-Chini Bhai years of the 1950s, actually had their inception during World War II. Coming to the next aspect, which is about the movement of people and commodities and how these were affected. The impact of the wartime years on pre-existing patterns of trade and movement of peoples between India and China presents a somewhat mixed picture. The brisk maritime connections that had developed along with Western imperialist networks in the 19th and early 20th centuries was severely disrupted on account of the Japanese occupation of much of coastal and central China and of transit points in Southeast Asia, such as Singapore and Malaya. Indian communities in Hong Kong and Eastern China kept their heads low and bided their time, but the conditions of war and occupation proved exceedingly difficult for most of them. The large number of policemen, jailers, and watchmen who depended on the Western presence in the Chinese treaty ports for their livelihood, in particular, found themselves destitute. Few had the funds or connections to arrange for air transportation from southwestern China back to India, and sea passage was blocked until the end of the war. When the war ended and passage became available, hundreds of Indians chose to board ships and repatriate to India, reducing the small but once thriving community of Indians in China to a shadow of its former self. A similar fate befell the people of Indian origin who are longtime residents of Xinjiang in Western China. Here it was less the conditions of World War II than the harsh regime of the governor of Xinjiang, Sheng Shicai, and the damage done by years of civil strife in the late 1930s and 1940s that disrupted the life of this old established community of Indian origin. By the end of the war, hundreds of Indians had been deported from Xinjiang, their property destroyed, and the overland trade on which they depended had shrunk to a pitiful amount. Even the removal of Sheng Shicai from his post by the Chiang Kai-shek government in 1944 did not lead to the revival of the traditional trade between India and Xinjiang. By contrast, the community of Chinese in India, which had grown incrementally on the basis of maritime connections since the late 18th century, expanded significantly during the war. There were several reasons for this. Thousands of Chinese sought to flee the harsh conditions of war and occupation of their homeland, and many made their way to India, using either the overland routes or securing for themselves air passage from places in South and West China and Southeast Asia. While the government of India was not pleased with any unregulated movement of Chinese into India and monitored it closely, it did not use harsh measures to stop it, mainly keeping the wartime alliance with China in mind. An unusual example of this was the permission it gave to several thousand mounted and armed Kazakhs fleeing Sheng Shicai's persecution in Xinjiang to enter India via Tibet and to settle in Bhopal and northwestern India for the duration of the war. The number of Chinese in India also swelled with the presence of thousands of stranded seamen and deserters from the Chinese army in India. Many arrivals from China saw India as a convenient transit point for other places further west. The existence of a Chinatown in Calcutta acted as a magnet for Chinese seeking to stay on or bide their time in India. It provided them a familiar place of refuge where they could quite literally disappear from the prying eyes of the authorities, as well as offered various forms of employment to sustain themselves. This has been well brought out in a very recent book by Dr. Cao Yan from Tsinghua University, entitled Chinese Sojourners in Wartime Raj, as well as in several articles by Dr. Arpita Bose, who has utilized files from the West Bengal State Archives. The war gave a fillip to the movement of people and commodities between Tibet and northeastern India in particular. Trade on this route continued briskly during the war years. The main item of import into India was Tibetan wool, which was in great demand. However, during the war, the importance of this route in supplying consumer goods to southwestern China enhanced the prosperity of this trade. One sign of the growing importance of this trade to China was the establishment of a branch of the Bank of China in Kalimpong. Files in the National Archives of India are replete with references to the increased movement of Chinese and Tibetan traders into Kalimpong during the war. Smuggling was a very profitable activity during the war. This was not confined to the overland trade, but was also deeply entrenched in the military and official networks that developed during the war. The National Archives files document many instances of smuggling by Chinese and American pilots flying the hump route, and by various people who had come to India purportedly on official or otherwise legitimate business. Much of this took place in the name of procuring medical supplies and other equipment vital to the war effort. A number of Chinese were stranded in India during the war because of the difficulty of returning home. Besides the Chinese seamen whom I just referred to, the disruption caused by the war led to a number of Muslim pilgrims who had embarked on the Hajj from China, getting stranded in India for the duration of the hostilities. In general, the war saw a massive displacement of peoples around the world, and thousands of people of various nationalities landed up in India. Between the fighting in Europe, North Africa, and West Asia on the one side, and the war in the Asia-Pacific region on the other side, India in the early 1940s appeared as a place of relative safety, order, and stability for many such people. At the very least, it offered a breathing space to those forced to float along on the tides of war. These included people stranded by a lack of means of transport to return home, refugees fleeing occupation and turmoil, as well as deportees and evacuees. India, as Yasmin Khan has noted in her book on India and wartime India, became a much more cosmopolitan place during the war. And among the major groups of people who found themselves in India due to such circumstances were Chinese. This picture of thousands of Chinese making their way to India or passing through India, propelled by their individual concerns about security and livelihood, a movement that was monitored but not greatly restricted by official agencies, presents a sharp contrast with the situation in the following decades. Even in the balmy days of India-China friendship in the early 1950s, this kind of relatively unrestricted movement was not possible. The closest to this that we have seen in recent times, perhaps, is the passage of plane loads of Indian businessmen in the reverse direction to Chinese commercial hubs, and of thousands of Indian students making their way to medical and engineering institutes in China. Coming to the last section, which is on the political dimensions of the relationship, the discourse in India on the political relations between India and China during the war has tended to highlight the rapport between Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek, or between the Indian National Congress and the Kuomintang. It has focused mainly on the two visits, Nehru's to China in 1939 and Chiang Kai-shek's to India in 1942, and on the contribution of the Indian medical mission to China's war effort. In reality, the situation was far more complicated, and the different threads in these relations need to be unraveled to arrive at a more realistic understanding of what was going on. In the first place, in spite of the apparent bonhomie between Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek, and the very real sympathy among broad sections of the Indian public with China's predicament during the war, the interests of the Chinese war effort and the Indian nationalist stream represented by the Congress did not converge. Chiang Kai-shek and his government understood the importance of India to China's resistance. He believed that British acceptance of the demands of the Indian National Congress would enhance and strengthen India's participation in the war. But he was not able to convince Churchill or the government of India about this. On its part, the leadership of the Indian National Congress sympathized with China's predicament, but was not willing to participate in the war effort without their demands being met. This deadlock was not resolved until the end of the war. Even though the differences were not publicly aired, the gap remained wide. On the other hand, the trend in the Indian national movement, represented by Subhash Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army, believed that the weakening of British power in Asia as a result of the war was a golden opportunity to strike the ultimate blow for India's freedom in conjunction with the armies of Japan. The INA may have been a marginal presence in India, but not among the Indian community in East and Southeast Asia. In China and Hong Kong, they received active support from substantial sections of the Indian community resident there. At the end of the war, the leaders and main activists of the INA in China were reviled by the Chinese authorities as collaborators and imprisoned and eventually deported. In short, it may be fair to conclude that the interests of Indian political circles and those of China's resistance effort, in a practical sense, diverged more than they converged. As a result, active cooperation between India and China in the war was largely in the hands of the British Raj and the nationalist government in China. Here too, the wartime alliance between British India and China was an uneasy one at best. The Chiang Kai-shek government, not unjustifiably, believed that Britain did not give it the respect due to a first-rank ally. Further, while the importance of maintaining some cordiality in the relationship with China was understood by London, the files in the National Archive of India make it clear that the government of India was less well-disposed towards China. The main reason for this was its suspicion of the Chinese government's growing interest and attempts to strengthen its positions in the regions bordering India. For China, the importance of consolidating its hold over territory in the western regions became all the more important after the occupation of its eastern regions by Japan. While recognizing the real limitations on its ability to do so, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek showed a greater determination to strengthen its hold over China's so-called lost territories than any government since the Qing. For decades, the British in India had considered the Russians as their main threat to their carefully constructed security system of protectorates and buffer states along India's land frontier. However, during the war, China's efforts to reassert its claims just north of the border with India, particularly in Tibet and to a lesser extent in Xinjiang, began to appear even more troublesome. The British authorities in India tried their best during the war years to see that the status quo that had been in place with respect to Tibet for some decades under the 13th Dalai Lama remained as it was. Any move proposed by the authorities in London to scale back the British presence in Tibet was stoutly opposed by the representatives of the government of India who actually dealt with Tibet. The installation of the new Dalai Lama in Lhasa in 1940, in a ceremony attended both by representatives of the government of India and a high-powered Chinese delegation led by Wu Zhongxin, became an occasion for one-upmanship by both the British and the Chinese. Their rivalry in Tibet took many forms, including competitive road building, opening bank branches, trying to mold public opinion in Tibet, and even giving donations to the more influential Tibetan monasteries. In general, the government of India was convinced that the Chinese were in a hurry to settle the status of Tibet on terms favorable to China before the post-war conference took place. To give another example, during the war, China had also sought to reassert its historical links with Hunza. Hunza was a small but strategically located principality, which was in a complicated subsidiary relationship with both British India and China. In 1939, there was a minor fracas over the disputed boundary between Hunza and Xinjiang in the neighborhood of the Shimshal Valley. However, it was decided not to exacerbate the issue at the time. The imperatives of the alliance during the war prevented direct conflict between British India and China over border and territorial issues. but it was clear that these had assumed greater importance in the eyes of both states precisely because of the conditions created by the war. In the wartime relations between the government of India and the Chinese government, issues such as smuggling, censorship of mail, jurisdiction over the Chinese armed forces in India, and other such matters were a constant source of minor irritation to both sides. A more serious concern of the government of India and its police and intelligence agencies was their suspicion that the Kuomintang and the Chinese government were trying to infiltrate India through their hold over Chinese resident in India. As the number of Chinese entering India increased during the war, the detailed files on individual Chinese and their activities increased, and the alarm over the Chinese presence in India grew. In sum, the picture we have of friendship between the Chinese leadership and the leaders of the Indian national movement, as well as the picture of British India and China as allies in the war, need to be deconstructed to understand the stresses and strains that lay just below the surface. The exigencies of wartime papered over some of the differences, but it was not long after the war that they came to the surface. Independent India did not begin its relations with China with a clean slate. When Nehru and his team forged their China policy in the early years, it was imbued with a mixture of both the earlier Pan-Asian solidarity as well as the inherited legacy of rivalry and tension over border issues and influence over the Himalayan states that began to loom large during the war. To sum up this period as a whole, one could say, to use colloquial language, that there was a lot going on between India and China at this time, marking a qualitatively new stage in their relationship. A greater consciousness of the importance of each to the other and the forging of connections in a number of new fields was perhaps the key feature, one that arose largely out of the new circumstances thrown up by the war. The maritime connection that had played an important role in the forging of new networks and modes of interaction between India and China in the preceding few centuries was abruptly choked off by the war in the Asia-Pacific region and the Japanese occupation. This brought back into focus the importance of the overland connections and routes, which had never dried up, but had perhaps assumed a lower profile in India-China relations. However, a consequence of this was the increasing attention paid by the two states to the land borders and the passage of people and goods across them, and the consequent spike in tensions on this issue among India, Tibet, and China. These two features, the expansion and increasing diversity of connections on the one hand, and the growing geopolitical tension and rivalry on the other hand, did not end with the war or even with the end of colonialism in this part of the world, but continued to characterize India-China relations in subsequent decades, right down to the present day. In that sense, it would perhaps not be inappropriate to see the period of World War II as the period when a new template of India-China relations was forged. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thank you, ma'am, for the thorough and a very rich exposition of India-China relations during the Second World War. I now invite Professor Sheel for his comments. Professor Sheel, are you there? Meanwhile, I would request the participants to put their questions in the chat box. Yes, Professor Sheel. For his comments.
Okay.
Professor, you're muted.
Sir, we can't hear you.
Professor Sheel, your audio, video are not coming through. Are you there? There you are. Yeah. You're still muted.
You're muted again.
Yes, you are unmuted now.
Yes, sir. I think you're unmuted now.
Yeah, could you, yeah,
Yes.
okay. Okay, so, no, I think, like Professor Thampi, has presented an excellent and illuminating, lecture, and was very densely argued and provided, much details on a very thinly researched topic, and it throws, new light on making of discourses on India-China relation during, World War II period. So she, provides, new angles to comprehend this relationship outside the nation-state framework and friendship enmity binary, as she has discussed in this lecture. So it like kind of give uh, an alternative to the grand narrative of civilizational connectedness and the larger issues in India-China connection. And she demonstrates that the World War II was an era full of extraordinary anguish, fear, and suspicion that witnessed geopolitical realignments and massive displacement. It witnessed multiple agencies defining and redefining linkages between two countries from their respective interests and purposes. So such movement of people and ideas contributed to alternative perspectives in negotiating relationship with the other, like India, China, they came together, and there were, like multiple agencies which were now involved in negotiating the connectedness in whether, it was a diplomatic connections or business or, connections through smuggling and other areas, which is an area which she has, highlighted. And though, like these connections were marginalized uh, connections, and mm, there were, like in terms of number of people involved, and, it was not, something like happening in the massive scale, but it produced, varieties of discourse that laid bare contradictions of nationalism and modernity. That was a very important, argument that Professor Thampi has produced, and so it directs us to fault lines of nationalism and modernity and highlights the play of collaboration and resistance in emerging linkages. So beyond, the grand narratives, you have this, I think, very detailed, descriptions of collaboration and resistance that went in making the India-China connection during the World War II period. And this narrative, as ever, is written by, Professor Thampi's very good hold over archival materials. It's enriched by new and intriguing information garnered from extensive research in archive and other repository. So it's mm, a kind of, say, intervention, which was much needed in any study of the history of India-China relationship. And I congratulate Professor Thampi for producing this based on, very solid archival work, and I hope she continues this area. One of the problems which I think that World War II period was also, say, very extraordinary period, and all nations were in making. So, and it was also the period, when the shift from civilizational emphasis to nation state was taking place. So nations were territorializing, and so she could also add, cartography, which, played very important role in mapping the boundaries and making the nation state. So in this context, I think this context could be added, and on the whole, like I really learned much from Professor Thampi's lecture. I missed, several parts because of several disruptions, in internet, and I don't know whether whatever I'm saying is clear or not because I'm using other computer and other things. But yeah, congratulations, Professor Thampi, for starting for such a wonderful note in the first keynote, address, and we look forward for more of such studies. So I think the floor is now open for questions. There must be many questions on this, very exciting area of research.
Thank you, Professor Sheel.
Yeah, could you
Due to
handle,
limitation of
a
time,
question answer
yes.
session, because I am not able to see, all the
Right, no issues.
pictures.
Yes. So we have one question from Professor Uberoy. She's requesting Dr. Thampi to comment on the scope of parallel Chinese historical or archival research on the same theme in reverse. Uh, we have limited time, so I think we would be only able to take this one question. I would request Professor Thampi to please comment on it.
Well, I think there are two scholars who have focused quite a lot on this wartime relations between India and China. So one is the scholar whom I mentioned, Professor Cao Yin, who's in Tsinghua University, who has, as I mentioned, he has brought out a book called Chinese Sojourners in the Wartime Raj. So he has dealt actually with this kind of traffic of Chinese. This is what I would say the second section of my talk. The traffic of Chinese coming through wartime India, but in a really lively and vivid way, because there were such interesting individual characters, as who had a sort of story in India at this time. And he has used not just the same files, I would say, in the National Archives of India, but he has also utilized files in archives in Taiwan and also, I think, People's Republic of China. So in a sense, he has really done a very deep work, and I would recommend anybody who is interested in this period to get his book, which was, I think, released only in September or October. So it's available now. Yes, some really interesting stories about, even mistaken identity, the British trying to follow deserter Chinese, deserter from the Chinese army, and two people with the same name and how they followed. And it's really reads like a very intriguing novel. Anyway, that he is one person. The other person is Liao Wenshuo in Taiwan, who works at the Academia Historica. In fact, that is a deep, great place to do research in this area, because a lot of the files to do with India-China relations are there in the Academia Historica in Taiwan. And she has worked a lot on Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek and their relationship, but using that archival material. So these are two people. Then there is, of course, Zhang He in Shanghai, Fudan University. But he's not so focused, as far as I know, on the wartime, World War II, but more on the overall colonial period India-China interactions. So these are some of the Chinese scholars I know who are working in the area, but they're not much. They're not many. There are far more Chinese scholars who work on, the ancient and the, early connections between India and China. So this is I would say this is a new field in China.
Thank you, ma'am. I don't see any other questions, but we can wait for 1 minute to check if there are more questions or raised hands. All
I
right.
can just
Uh,
say one thing, add something myself. You know, I think we have a tendency to want to see either the good or the bad in our relations with China. This is what Professor Kamal also picked up. And because of that, we miss a lot. And so if depending on the political climate or the general atmosphere at that time, a whole lot of research will be, I would say, some of it quite overlapping on certain themes, whether it is, the China as an enemy or as a friend or a civilizational friendship. And I think we need to have a very realistic understanding that you can have these are two huge productive regions of the world, quite in the same part of the world. They're bound to have had so many kinds of relations. And all of it together goes into the sum total of India-China relations. And unless we take it all into account, it's very hard for us to really get a good understanding of these relations. So that's what I was trying to do through this lecture and some of the work I've been trying to do.
Professor Alka Acharya has raised her hand. Ma'am, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Madhavi, fascinating as usual. I wasn't going to say anything except that your last comments combined with what Professor Sheel had begun with, not begun in the sense that the point he'd made. See, between the macro and the micro falls the shadow, as it were. So we have a very almost a clinical manner in which this whole macro business of civilizational ties is used at the official level. And it's constantly reiterated as if to emphasize that by itself gives a very valid reason for countries to start engaging as if they are fully cognizant of everything, which is still not known in the present. And to what extent does that civilizational formula really filter down in terms of influencing attitudes is absolutely unclear. And on the other hand, we have barely begun to scratch the surface, as you said, that scholars are just not going into this phase, which will actually provide the best antidote to that romanticized civilizational encounter and this territorial nation state animosity. So how do we really bring the focus on this period when we seem to be caught between two worlds? And the middle period, which is really the most fascinating period in terms of the complexity, diversity of encounters, bringing together connected geographies, connected histories, what Manu was saying in the first session. How do we do this? I am, beginning to despair of ever getting students in as large numbers as the ones who move towards the strategic and security dimensions to come to this particular period and mine this period. So those are just some thoughts plus some reactions. Thank you.
I would really, urge students who are, utilize the materials that are there in the National Archives. I myself was not aware there was so much till we started trying to catalog them. There are two catalogs which ICS has produced as monographs, but there is a larger documentation of the files which was part of another project, which will hopefully go online soon, which has documented all the material, not just in this World War II period and all, but from 1912 to 1949. It's a mine of things. I think students always have a problem to find something new or original to do. If they have an inclination, I'm not saying do history just for the sake of it, but if you have an inclination or an interest in history, just go and go into those archives and please use the catalogs we have produced. It shouldn't be someone my age really so who is sitting and reading that. There should be a lot of younger people working on it. But I must say I was quite happy when the last time before the pandemic, when I last went into the archives and sat there for 3 weeks or so, I found 3 or 4 of our China people there, young people, former students or students of colleagues, and they were working on things. So, there is some hope. But I really feel that that's a minefield. Somebody just wants to explore it. They'll have a grand time in there. Thank you.
We have another raised hand from Professor Manoranjan Mohanty. So, Professor, please go ahead.
Manu, you are muted.
Just a second. I think now the permissions are open, and I think Professor would be able to unmute. Professor Mohanty, could you try speaking now?
He's unmuted now.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I just
Yes.
want to compliment Madhavi for this fantastic lecture. One more such lecture as a contribution. Now, a very important methodological point we derive from this study and from her earlier studies. War histories are not only macro, very general perspectives, they are guided by certain state narratives, state-guided, highly motivated narratives. They have to be broken up, they have to be challenged. And what Madhavi has presented is the alternative part is about the totality. I don't know whether it would be called people's history, total history. I don't have a name, but I think this, the complexity, multidimensionality, which constitute the overall picture. I think this is the alternative to the large number of war histories, war history archives, war history narratives that we have. I just wanted to add that point as a very important methodological, and there are many methodological implications of such studies. Thank you very much, Madhavi.
All right. So I think we are ending right on time now. If there are no more questions, with ma'am's permission, I would like to conclude this session. All right. So thank you, everyone. With this, we come to an end of the day 1 of 15th AICCS. We had a successful first day, which started with an insightful keynote by Professor Dwara. We also had a rich exchange of ideas on the state of China studies in India by seasoned researchers and academicians. In the afternoon, we started off with a thought-provoking discussion on Northeast India and Trans-Himalayan connections. This was followed by, of course, this wonderful, comprehensive and rich narration of India-China relations during the Second World War. I would like to thank our partners, the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati University, Omio Kumar Das, Institute of Social Change and Development, and India Office Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I would also like to thank all the participants for attending this session. All the sessions were well attended, and we would love to have you all tomorrow. We start at 11 a.m. in the morning tomorrow. The recordings of all the sessions that were conducted today will be available on our YouTube channel. With this, thank you to everyone. We will be back tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Madhavi. Yeah.
Thanks, Madhavi. Thanks, Professor Sheel.